Hey everyone, today on Big Al Books, I'm doing part one of my April wrap-up. As you can see from the books that I've read in the first half of the month, I was apparently attracted to really bright and colorful spines on my books. There's a bit of a rainbow effect going on here. As well, you can see that these books are all on the short side. So I think I'm still recovering from the intensity of the March of the Mammoths readathon, where I exclusively read 800 plus page books in the month of March. It was a wonderful experience, and I loved diving deep into those books. But I have been having this rebound thing where right now I'm just looking for these like short, zippy, good time kind of books. So today I'll be telling you about these first 7 books that I've read in the first half of the month, and then in part 2 I will tell you about the other 7 books. I'll start off by talking about the comics and graphic novels that I read this month, because that was actually what I found myself missing the most in the month of March. And it was actually in the month of March last year when I started heavily getting interested in reading graphic novels and comics. So that love has certainly been sustained throughout the year, and I'm still going strong, and I really missed reading them in the month of March. One of the graphic novels that I read was The Killing Joke by Alan Moore and Brian Bolland. This was one of my random TBR picks for the month, and I thought being such a short book that it would be a nice one-sitting read for me, but I actually fell asleep a few times reading this one. So it did take me a while, but I quite enjoyed this one once I finished it. I've never read any Batman comics before. I'm not big into the superhero comics world, but I really enjoy Alan Moore's work, and this was no exception. Also, of course, being a dark soul, of course I'm interested in learning more about this mysterious character of the Joker. So this book is exploring a potential backstory of his, and it also gets into that adversarial relationship that he has with Batman, and Batman is really wondering why they always have to be at odds with each other and whether it's going to come down to one of them killing the other. And I really understood after reading this book kind of what their struggle represents, since they both seem to be archetypes. Batman seems to represent order, justice, logic, reason, society, and the Joker is kind of more of a figure of anarchy, lawlessness, chaos, and of course insanity. The Joker asks a lot of questions about what it really means to be an insane person, whether becoming insane is the only reasonable response that makes sense in a world that can be so painful and brutal and pointlessly and randomly cruel. So there's some big philosophical questions being asked in this comic, which I really enjoyed, and it also reminded me of the character, the comedian from Alan Moore's graphic novel Watchmen, who is also another character that really understands the violence and misery and suffering in the world and chooses to interpret everything as some kind of big absurd joke, and that's his only way to cope with living in this place. So you can see there are some shared themes between the two works for sure. So I enjoyed this one more than I expected to. Even though it is very dark and disturbing at times, I thought that this was a really cool book that had an engaging story, some really brilliant artwork, and asked a lot of interesting questions. I also ended up reading Megahex by Simon Hanselman. This is a collection of comics that is about a stoner witch, her talking cat boyfriend, and then also you get to meet a few of their loser friends. So this was just a really strange collection, and I'm not really sure what to make of it. So it starts off, you think they're just going to be some kind of like stupid, silly, stoner humor kind of comics, and the first few ones did make me laugh a little bit. But then about a third of the way through these comics, there's this strange sexual assault scene that's played off as a joke, and I just found it really uncomfortable, and it was hard to recover from that for me. It was hard to bounce back and then just laugh at the hijinks of the characters after that when I saw how like really dysfunctional and twisted their relationship was. So there actually are trigger warnings on the front of this book. So I am glad to see that the author did make some sort of effort to let the reader know what was going to be happening, but I still wasn't quite prepared for that big shift in tone that ended up happening. So I just found the whole second 2/3 of this kind of more difficult to get through because it just wasn't really funny anymore. It just kind of became sad. And that was the thing with this book. It just got really depressing really fast. And in some ways, I think that it is a really powerful look at depression and malaise, particularly in these sort of young, like 20, 30-something characters who really don't have a particular direction or focus with their life. And it brought that situation into perspective with an almost uncomfortable clarity. Whenever you'd see their apartment, it was always just so messy, and you could see that the friendships that they have with each other are toxic and they can't really get away from each other. And you can see how the apathy of these characters has caused them to be really stuck in this rut where they just continue to make the same bad decisions and never really work to improve their lives. Some of the artwork does a very powerful job of just showing how overwhelming depression can be, and you really understand why some of the characters are trapped in the vicious cycles that they are. So there's just some wonderful artwork throughout this comic that I did really appreciate, but really it wasn't as fun and silly as I thought it was going to be at the beginning, so really it was just a big downer of a read. So I'm not really sure that I would recommend this one. While I think it does capture the mundanity of living with depression, it does take the reader to a bit of a dark headspace, and so many of the characters in this book are just really mean towards one another, which I didn't have fun reading about. I think I'm glad that I read it, but I didn't have fun while I was reading it like I expected to, and it just kind of brought me down, so I did not love Megahex as much as I wanted to. Moving on into novels, the two contemporary books that I read both addressed some very similar questions about authorship and putting together a narrative and taking power back through that narrative. So the first one of these books that I'm going to talk about is When I Hit You by Meena Kandasamy. I first heard about this one last year when it was on the shortlist for the Women's Prize. Even though I did really want to read this last year, I just never got around to it, so I was really happy to see it show up as one of my random TBR picks for this month. And I guess since I'm not that interested in the long list of the Women's Prize this year, I can feel okay justifying reading books from the list from last year instead. And man, I am glad that I picked up this book. This was intense, but it was a really incredible reading experience. So this is a book about the experiences of a woman who has left an abusive relationship, and she's reflecting back on that time and what it was like to be in that situation and what it's like to leave afterwards. This pulled me right in from the beginning. It starts off with the woman's mother telling everyone these stories about how she was such a victim in her relationship and she was on death's door when she left this man, and right away, the narrator of this story refuses to be a character in someone else's version of this narrative. She wants to take back her agency and tell this story in her own way. This made for such a really rich and complex reading experience because the narrator uses so many different tones and moods to tell her story. At times, it can be like bitingly funny and sarcastic. At other times, you can really see the unflinching violence and horror of her situation. At other times, it's just very poetic. There are so many powerful metaphors at play in this book that can really help you understand what it was like for her to be in this experience. And that's why I think this is such a powerful read. This book did give me a new understanding of what it's like to be a partner in this kind of relationship, and you really do understand what the narrator is going through. A lot of people who are on the outside of these kind of relationships have a lot of questions. When we see this woman who is so talented and smart and funny, and you wonder how she gets trapped in this situation, but you do really understand it after reading this book, and I loved how she presented this narrative. She uses her experience as a writer as a way to survive the violence of her day-to-day existence. Oftentimes in her marriage, she would have to distance herself from what was happening and view herself as simply a character in some kind of drama that was unfolding, and she would have to rise above it and view herself as the cinematographer or the person who's putting this narrative together. There were a lot of fascinating narrative techniques at play in this book. Also, the character of the husband was never one-dimensional. He wasn't just like this full-out terrible man. He was actually a bit of a contradiction in that he is this well-educated professor who many people respect, and he is very dedicated to the ideals of communism, which you think would mean that he cares about the suffering of human beings, and yet while he's obsessed with helping the working class rise up, he is still just a totally brutal person to his own domestic partner because of his jealousy and insecurities. So it's this real contradiction. So I loved so much about this book. Of course, it's not an easy read, but I thought it was a very powerful one. All of these words that you see describing it on the cover, I thought held true. It was this artfully constructed, poetic book that still was so emotional and raw. I thought it was an amazing reading experience, and I'm glad I picked it up. Next up is Trust Exercise by Susan Choi. This is a new release that I feel like had some similarities with When I Hit You, and that it's very much about the art of constructing a narrative, how people tell their stories, how they take events that happened in real life and transform them in fiction, and how they deliver that information to the reader. So this is a book that is set at a performing arts high school in the 1980s. I originally put this on hold at the library, but then one night I saw it at the drugstore, and I've never bought a book from the drugstore before because usually the books that are there are very much on the commercial fiction side, and there's not a lot of things that I'm interested in there. But I decided to pick this one up, and I think that changed my expectations for what I thought this book was going to be. Because it was with all those other mass market paperbacks, I thought that this also was going to be kind of a pretty plot-heavy commercial story of a weird drama teacher, and that is really not at all what this book is about. Rather, this is a book that is more about surprising shifts in narrative perspectives. So it's one of those books where you start a new section and it completely undermines the section that you'd read before it. And that was shocking to me because I had no idea that that was coming up. And that's also what gave me a lot more interest and engagement in this book. So while I think that technique is going to push some readers away, it should also really pull some other types of readers in. If you are someone who is interested in those literary techniques about how a narrative is constructed, and particularly that concept of how writers take these real people and these real events from their life and try to change them up into fictional entities, and how disorienting it can be for the real people who do find themselves as these weird shadow figures of themselves in fictional representations where they feel like the story is just completely wrong. So it is asking a lot of these really compelling questions about what it means to be an author, and how the reader kind of has this automatic impulse to trust the author of a book and just believe that the story that you're hearing is the one that's happening. And this book is really all about playing with that idea of that trust between the writer and their real subject matter, the trust between the author and the reader, the narrator and the reader. All of those things are being played with. So I did find that fun. Now, I will say that even though I liked the questions that this book was asking, I didn't always love the execution of this book. So the first full section of the book is about these teenage high school students, and in particular it's about two teenagers who are having this very stormy romance where they have so much sexual chemistry, but they just can't seem to make it work in a relationship. And I didn't love reading about all that teen drama and teen heartbreak, and I especially did not enjoy reading about the explicit teen sex scenes. Like, it's fair, you know, teenagers have these feelings and hormones, but like, I don't want to read about it, especially in graphic detail. Like, just kind of made me uncomfortable. There is particularly one sex scene that is like iconically catastrophic in this book. It was like the most awkward thing I had read in my life, but it was really intended to be that way, so it was a strange experience all around. So I didn't love the first section that much, although I did enjoy reading about what it's like to be a drama student. It kind of took me back to some of my memories of drama class, and it is really this like strange experience for people to go through together, the games that you play in drama class, the experiences that you do to try to open yourself up. So I was interested in reading about those parts, but not as much the interpersonal relationships between the characters. Then the book becomes inherently more interesting in the second narrative where everything's flipped over on its head, but I did also find the writing style of the second narrative to be a bit trying. The particular character who's narrating this section is someone who's done a lot of therapy, so there's a lot of therapy jargon in this section, as well as she's someone who's obsessed with etymology and is always trying to give you definitions of words and their double meanings that a lot of people don't realize, which is like kind of cool and interesting on one hand, but also really takes you out of the story. And it seems like such a writerly thing to do, to really define the words and show how they're connected with the situations. So I think that this is going to be a book that other people who are interested in writing and words and telling a story are going to really get a kick out of. But if you're like a reader who just wants a story of cool things happening between people, you might be a bit frustrated with this. So I can really understand the polarizing reactions that people have to this book. I think for myself, I fall somewhere in the middle. I like what this novel is trying to do. I don't think that it completely worked for me, but I'm still really glad that I checked it out. So I guess I'm happy to report back that my first buying a book from a drugstore experience was a pretty positive one, all things considered. The next novel I'm going to talk about was my biggest pleasant surprise of the month by far, and that was The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, one of the books in the Sherlock Holmes series. So I read this book for a certain project that I have planned on my channel. I never really saw myself as being someone who would enjoy the Sherlock Holmes books. Like, I'm not a big mystery reader, and to me, Sherlock Holmes is someone who represents logic and reason and deduction, and that's not really the way that I like thinking. I'm a lot more messy and chaotic and postmodern, I guess. So like, I'm the kind of person who really likes Twin Peaks, where the FBI investigator tries to solve crimes by having cryptic dreams in the future and by throwing rocks at milk bottles. So I love solving crimes in ways that don't make any sense. So I thought, like, am I really going to enjoy reading about this detective who like notices every little detail and can figure everything out with his reason? Did not think that it was going to be for me. But I do have to say that, like, I was so wrong. I was so completely wrong thinking that I was not going to like this novel. In fact, I actually ended up loving this novel to bits. This was easily a 5-star read for me, which was like the biggest shock of my reading year so far. Even the first chapter, I was feeling like I was a bit annoyed with Sherlock Holmes and the way that he talks and like thinks that he's smarter than everyone else, but like this story sucked me in really quickly. And I think the big reason for that is because it is set on the moors of the English countryside, and I'm just obsessed with the moors. Anytime the moors show up, I am there for the party. Anytime that the moors were described, which they are in many wonderful descriptive passages here, I was just like smiling and living my best life. I loved reading about this spooky atmosphere that was just full of foul bogs and mysterious abandoned huts from primitive peoples that have lived on this harsh land. So like, I was just here for this book, and it was just so much weirder than I was expecting it to be. I mean, the whole premise of this book is weird, where we're trying to figure out whether there's some kind of supernatural, diabolical hound that's running around on the moors and killing certain members from this cursed family. Really, this book was just so extra. The characters were so dramatic and strange. The relationship between Sherlock and Watson is also a wonderful thing. So I loved reading this book. Now, I don't really think that I'll be able to love any other books in the Sherlock series as much as this one, since I think part of what really drew me into this story was the setting on the moors. That's what brought me the most joy. But I'm still much more open now to this world. I thought that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had written like 1,000,000 Sherlock novels, and then I found out that there are only really 4 full-length novels, so that was a surprise. I also did start watching the more recent BBC version of Sherlock with Benedict Cumberbatch, and I am living for that too, and I'm about to watch The Hound of the Baskervilles episode, so I'm really excited for that. So I'm just so glad that I read this one, and I enjoyed every minute of it. And I guess the lesson here is that you shouldn't try to limit yourself as a reader or assume that you're not going to like something until you've actually gone and tried it for yourself, because sometimes you'll end up being very pleasantly surprised. Up next, I have another very pleasant read, and that was Idiophone by Amy Fusselman. This is an essay, but as you can see when you look at the pages, it's also written in more of a verse structure, which I thought was really engaging. You could really quickly flip through the pages in this. It wasn't as dense as poetry, but it was also more fun and fast-paced than a regular essay would be, so I really loved this experience. This is also the kind of book where I can't really sit here and tell you what it's about. It's an experience, and you really have to go for it yourself. I can tell you that it explores the subjects of being a creative person, whether you're a musician or a writer or putting together quilts. It does explore that creative process and someone who does things in an experimental style. So it's about people who don't fit in to the rules and regulations of the world, and they have their own visions and their own way of sharing their visions with people. It's about the Nutcracker, and that was a ballet that I had written off for a long time as just being like, oh, the popular ballet that everyone goes to every year. But it really made me appreciate what that ballet is and how weird and different it is than everything else. So it got me really excited about ballet and what it was like for Tchaikovsky to write this ballet. He only got these little cryptic instructions and he somehow made this glorious music out of them. It's about inspiration and where that comes from, motherhood, addiction, family relationships. I can't even begin to tell you what is explored in here at this like fast and furious pace, but this was just such a delight to read. So if you're looking for an experimental essay that is just so much fun and such a joy to read, I really would recommend this one. Last up, I have a slim little nonfiction book. This is Live Through This by Anwen Crawford. This is an installation in the 33 and a half series that provides an investigation into a certain album. So Live Through This, if you haven't heard this album, is the second album by the band Hole, which the band is not really as famous as their notorious frontwoman, who is of course Courtney Love, and a lot of people have a lot of different opinions on this woman. Now, I'm coming from the perspective of someone who does enjoy some of Courtney Love's music, and Hole as a band were very important in my formative years. I think I was listening to them around the age of 13 and onwards. And there's just something that was really powerful about seeing this really brash woman who was just not afraid to be so different than what was considered to be acceptable for a woman. You know, she is someone who is just like loud and outspoken, and her aesthetic is just really messy and unconventional. She's just this really fascinating figure, and as weird as it sounds for someone who is so famous for just being a train wreck and getting into trouble, she was somehow a weird, good kind of role model for me when I was growing up, in that I did feel that I could be someone who made my own music and presented myself the way that I wanted to, even if it was like different or strange. So I liked reading this book because it also had lots of interviews with other people who felt this way growing up listening to Hole and finding value in what they did, even if most other people on the planet can't really stand Courtney Love or see the appeal. So I liked those aspects of the book. However, I don't think that this was a very tightly constructed narrative on the album, nor did I think that it really gave me a lot of new information about it. It kind of just felt like some loosely connected blog posts where the book is structured based around different songs from the album, and I felt like it just kind of meandered from topic to topic. So I might have appreciated a book that had a bit more narrative or direction connecting it all together, but still, I find it interesting reading about Courtney Love and Hole and how she's been represented in the media, and all of those topics. Wasn't great, but still glad that I checked it out. So that's it for the books that I've finished in the first half of the month of April, and as good as these books were, I can't wait to film part 2 because I've been reading even better books in the second half of the month. I've got some incredible reads that I've already finished that I can't wait to talk about, and some other books that I'm in progress and very close to finishing, and they are very promising so far. So thanks for checking out part 1 of my wrap-up, and hopefully I'll see you again in part 2 where we can talk about some more incredible books.